Closing Guantanamo. Obama looks to lock down his legacy. But can he get it done? Is he putting U.S. security at risk? And in picture this, tear gas and protests. Fears that a humanitarian crisis is unfolding on Europe's doorstep. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. On January 22, 2009, just 2 days after he was sworn in as President of the United States, Barack Obama signed an executive order to close Guantanamo Bay. Now, 7 years later, he wants to make good on that promise and close the prison's gates once and for all. He may have a plan, but time is running out. As his second term draws to a close, the president has a long and uphill battle ahead of him. In his way stands Congress, and they look unlikely to budge, saying they will not jeopardize security over a campaign promise. But it's a promise that Obama is looking to secure to distance his legacy from the Bush administration. Today's newsmaker is the Cuban detention facility, as we ask if Obama can call time on Guantanamo.
By the authority vested in me as President by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, in order to effect the appropriate disposition of individuals currently detained by the Department of Defense at Guantanamo, and promptly to close the detention facility at Guantanamo. There we go.
It was one of President Barack Obama's campaign promises and first executive orders. But after 2 terms in office, he's still failed to close Guantanamo Bay. The high-security facility in Cuba was America's response to 9/11. When then-President George W. Bush opened the prison in 2002, he filled it with nearly 800 suspected militants as part of his war on terror. His administration labeled the prisoners hardened killers. But to justice advocates, the camp was a place of shame, where suspects were locked up, many without charge. In the eyes of critics, Guantanamo Bay operates outside the law. Its location in Cuba allowed it to evade international human rights laws until the U.S. Supreme Court ruled otherwise. The legality of certain torture methods was also disputed, including force-feeding inmates on hunger strike and waterboarding.
Inside the interrogation room, but sometimes you can hear some people screaming and like that, but you can never see what's going on there.
The White House has made a fiscal case for shutting down the facility and saving almost $2 billion over the next 20 years. But Obama's biggest argument for closure is that Guantanamo has acted as a rallying cry for America's enemies and has been used as a recruitment tool for terrorism. Obama's plan to close Guantanamo affects the 91 remaining detainees. 35 prisoners have already been cleared for transfer to other countries. 10 inmates will be allowed to continue their trials at military courts. The rest are likely to be moved to different U.S. facilities and have their reviews for detention accelerated. Prisoners deemed too dangerous may be detained indefinitely. But Republicans say the plan is flawed. They argue it's both unsafe and illegal for the military to bring Guantanamo detainees into the U.S. President Obama will have to push his plan through the Republican-controlled Congress and fight public opposition. Moving detainees to the mainland is highly unpopular. Polls suggest more than half of Americans are opposed to closing the prison. Obama's last resort is to issue an executive order to unilaterally close Guantanamo Bay, a final chance to fulfill his campaign promise and shape his legacy. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss if Obama should or can close down Guantanamo Bay, I'm joined now by journalist and award-winning artist Molly Crabapple, who's been inside the detention facility. She's in New York, and in Washington is Tom Rogan, a columnist for the National Review. Thanks both of you for joining us. Tom Rogan, let's start with you. Is President Obama putting national security at risk?
I think he is. It's good to be with you. I think he is, but I think, ultimately the president believes what he's doing is right. I think he believes that the presence of Guantanamo Bay is a recruiting sergeant for terrorists around the world. But the problem here, I think, is twofold. Number one, I think that the military tribunal system as it exists now, with the people who are detained there, who have not been cleared for release, being entering into that process, either through military trial or through review boards going forwards, is a better way of securing US national security interests. And then on the flip side, I think by bringing people to the United States, to federal prisons or military detention facilities, the risk there would be that you both invite terrorists in terms of inspired attacks around those locations, especially because of the influence of groups like the Islamic State or ISIL. But at the same time, you alter the tenor of the debate in terms of confronting groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, in the sense that you put it into the domain of civilian criminal justice rather than, I would say, the orbit of conflict in terms of military justice.
Tom, how strong is that argument really? I mean, these guys, sure, they'll be on US soil, but they're not going to be hanging out at Dunkin' Donuts, right? They're going to be in very secure facilities. How realistic is it that there's going to be explosions or people blowing things up just because Guantanamo Bay detainees are on US soil?
I think it's highly unlikely that any of these people would be able to escape from the facilities they were held at. I mean, the federal supermax prisons are essentially impossible to escape from. The problem, though, and this is where my concern rests, is that the towns and settlements proximate to those locations, I think certainly would become magnets for terrorism. And you do see that in places across the world, again, especially in the Middle East, especially with the groups like the Islamic State, where there is quite a big strategic impetus to liberate prisoners that are being held by an opposing force, whether it be the Iraqi government or someone else.
Okay, let's bring in Molly Crabapple. Molly, almost a third of these men have returned to violence. So even if they were innocent in the first place, they've now gone and joined Daesh or Al-Qaeda. This is what they call, I guess, Gitmo recidivism. Is it a risk worth taking, Molly?
First of all, I would challenge that statistic. According to the Director of National Intelligence, the men who were released after 2009, 6% have actually returned to violence, 6%. If you compare this to the recidivism rate of American criminal prisoners, that's 50%. This is staggering. The idea that we would have this thing that is both a moral stain on our society and a major recruiting tool out of fear that a handful of men might join ISIS, this is the politics of cowardice. This is the failed politics of cowardice that led to groups like ISIS being created in the first place.
Molly, I'll give you another example, or a specific example. Ibrahim al-Qusi, Sudanese, spent a decade in Guantanamo Bay, confessed to being a part of Al-Qaeda, considered cooperative. He cut a deal. He was released to Sudan in 2012, showed up just last December in an Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula propaganda video as a leader of Al-Qaeda, calling for attacks in Yemen, in Somalia, in the West, etc. Again, I ask you, is it a risk worth taking?
Absolutely, some prisoners from Guantanamo have either returned to joining terrorist groups or, inspired by the abuse they suffered, joined terrorist groups. No one is denying this. However, you cannot have a policy where you kidnap, torture, and then imprison at the cost of $1 million a year every single person you suspect might have some potential of engaging in attacks against the US. I mean, that's ludicrous. We would both bankrupt our country and commit moral crimes.
Tom, I want to ask you about the 24 law of war detainees, also known as the forever prisoners. Now, the government's not really willing to put them on trial, often because the case is tainted by torture, but they consider them too dangerous to release them. So, I mean, what is the solution? To leave them to die in prison without ever having been charged? Isn't that the reason why President Obama is saying this is contrary to our values, Tom?
Well, look, I think President Obama is, recognizing that frankly those people can't be released because of their stated intent now, many years, a decade or more after being detained, to continue to wage an existential war against the United States. And look, the nature of the threat we face, whether it be through Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State or someone else or another Salafi jihadist group, is such that these people are, as they see it, on a global mission to massacre as many people as they can in pursuit of a theological, a political interpretation of their theology. And the reason that they cannot be released is that threat is very real, and it's not about civilian recidivism in terms of criminals. And also, Molly mentions that point about 6%. Well, I would say the 29% example there, what they're talking about is people in the whole logistics train, the people providing the weaponry, the supplies, the training, which facilitates those massacres of civilians, as we saw, for example, in Paris most recently, but also in Istanbul, Jakarta. And so what I think the best process here to do with those people who cannot be brought to trial is for an open process of detainee review boards every couple of years or whatever it might be, to go before that board and say, okay, now this is why I should be released. So clarity and openness, I think, is the key here. And I think that is why in previous years, Guantanamo has had this very negative stain on its reputation. In the sense, far too much was held behind closed doors. And so it allowed the purveyors of those who believe that torture is systemic at Guantanamo, which I do not, to push their line of argument.
Molly, does that sound reasonable at all to you?
These military review boards are tainted with fantasy, with ludicrous accusations, with accusations derived from hearsay, from torture. Any testimony given by U.S. officials to them was just presumed to be the truth. They're not any sort of tool that you could use to find out the truth of allegations against someone. And I highly, highly debate that there is a reason that we can't try people. You have someone like Suleiman Abu Ghaith, right? He, Osama bin Laden's son-in-law, he was accused of being a propagandist for Al-Qaeda. He was tried in New York City, and he was declared guilty. And I see no reason why anyone who has legitimate charges against them cannot be brought to the U.S. and charged in a U.S. court according to our justice system, and why they have to instead face this Alice in Wonderland style form of made-up law.
Tom, Suleiman Abu Ghaith tried in a civilian court on U.S. soil. There you go. The system works. Why aren't you happy with that?
Well, it works in some cases, but I would say there's two specific problems there. Number one, the people we are dealing with are not criminals. They are part of organizations that are dedicated to a global agenda, a war-based agenda, and in a broad sort of definition of the term.
Then hold them as prisoners of war.
Well, but see, the problem is they don't subscribe to the tenets of war in terms of under the Geneva Convention. So they deliberately, and that I think speaks to the point here, that a lot of these individuals, a lot of these groups deliberately manipulate the system in order to serve their own interests. And I would say the reason why you can't specifically bring a lot of these people into civilian court is because a lot of the intelligence that surrounds why they were detained in the first place comes from foreign intelligence services. And one of the big, and the big problem with that is that if you bring information from a foreign intelligence service into the open domain, that foreign intelligence service, we're talking about the Jordanian GID, for example, they're not going to share it with you again. And so I guess the crux of the issue
extensively
is these. Well, but look, here's the balance. The critical issue is whether it is more in the United States' interest to release these people and to gamble that they won't be involved in terrorist campaigns around the world, or whether it is better to detain them.
Okay,
and I come down on the side that it is better to detain them. And I think
Sure.
the majority of the American people,
Let's get a
frankly
response
people
from
around the world would agree with that.
Okay, let's get a response, Molly.
But this is not fact-based. This is primarily based on emotion, not fact. I mean, perhaps it would make America safer if they all put us into comas. I mean, that's not what America is based on. America is a country based on the rule of law, and it's based on a certain respect for freedom. And you cannot just go around kidnapping people, having them tortured by foreign intelligence services, which is what you're referring to with the Jordanians, and then keeping them in an island prison outside of the rule of law because you're afraid that if you release them, they might join a terrorist group that was not even in existence when they were originally detained.
Okay, I have a political question for you, Tom. Is it going to help or harm any resolution regarding Guantanamo Bay, given that it's a black and white political hot button issue between Democrats and Republicans coming down hard on both sides? here, Tom?
Look, I think, well, number one, I would disagree with the premise. I think the majority of Republicans, conservatives certainly have long been concerned with the notion about closing Guantanamo. I think the line of argument is much stronger now because of the reforms into the military justice system and the detention system and the review boards that have been brought in since then. But I think it's unlikely that President Obama can. Look, he is doing this as part of his legacy. There's no doubt about that. I think, frankly, behind the scenes, the White House would admit that. But because of the laws that Congress have brought into play, in terms of amendments to appropriations bills, the president doesn't have the authority to bring them back to the United States using federal funds. I don't think he will be able to do that. And I also think the broader issue here, when we're talking about the threat of terrorism and having a sensible debate, as I would like to think we are at the moment, the risk is that where you allow a process where people are perceive that you are being weak on counterterrorism and have grounds to believe that, if there is another attack, the people who benefit most from that are people like Donald Trump, who will use the politics of real politics of fear rather than the politics of argument and debate. And so I think we have to be very careful here that we don't try and push these debates into too much of a overt political notion, that it's either about legacy or it's about bland extractionism to prevent President Obama from having his legacy. The debate is critical because absent that, much worse can foster for American democracy.
Molly, do you agree with that? Final thoughts, please, because we are running out of time. Go ahead.
ISIS is a repellent terrorist organization that will attack us whether or not they perceive us as quote-unquote weak. That has nothing to do with this. This is about our values and what we are as a country. And we should not be a country that kidnaps, tortures, and indefinitely detains people. That has nothing to do with our feelings about weakness or strength. It has everything to do with the basis of what America is supposed to be.
Values. We'll leave it at that. Molly Crabapple and Tom Rogan. Unfortunately, I've got to wrap. I was enjoying this very much. So thank you very much for joining us. In today's Picture This, protests have turned violent on Greece's border with Macedonia after police fired tear gas at refugees as they tried to cross into the country. Greece is now bearing the brunt of the migrant crisis as Macedonia and 3 other Balkan countries shut down their borders, leaving thousands of refugees trapped in Greece. Let's take a look. Today's newsmaker has been Guantanamo Bay. US President Barack Obama has renewed efforts to close the detention camp, attempting to fulfill one of his nearly decade-old campaign promises and securing his administration's legacy. He says closing the door on Guantanamo is about closing a chapter in American history, a chapter that some say is a blight on the US reputation and a violation of international law. But at the heart of this highly politicized debate remains a key question. Can Obama house or try detainees on US soil? And until those questions are answered, it seems unlikely that the US president will be able to turn the key and close Guantanamo's gates. You've been watching this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Gupta. As always, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.